Welcome to the Classical U podcast. I'm Jesse Hake. I'm the director at Classical U. Classical U is a subsidiary of Classical Academic Press, a curriculum and monograph publishing company. At Classical U, we provide training for teachers and parents interested in learning more about classical education, how to deliver this method in your classrooms, in your homes. I mostly spend time talking with presenters and live learning event guests, and we look forward to sharing more with you as you tune in. Thank you. It's great to be with Brian Williams as we're recording together for the Women in the Tradition course, which involves many different presenters. It's been underway for quite some time. It's exciting to have that just about finished here, and always exciting to catch up with Brian and all the work he does here. We're at Eastern University and the Templeton Honors College. They're about to go on the freshman class camping trip that kicks off the Templeton Honors College each year, and I hope to ask about that. The MAT program, master's degree for classical teachers, is another area of responsibility that Brian has. He's worked with several others to get the Principia Journal for Classical Education off the ground in the last several years, and be some great things to talk about there. His lecture just now was on Christine de Pizan, and just more broadly, the topic of women in the tradition and the nature of the canon and tradition, as he's also written about recently in a journal article. So, Brian, thanks so much for letting me chat with you.
Jesse, this is great. I always love time to catch up with you, whether it's here or further west in Pennsylvania or wherever we intersect at whatever conference we happen to be at. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So tell me a little bit about the camping trip that you've got coming up with the Templeton Honors College. How is it that you head off to the Adirondacks as the first thing you do?
Yeah, no, it's great. We leave in less than 2 days' time. In the Honors College, we invite all of our freshmen to come a week before classes start. And we load up and we drive up north to the high peaks area of the Adirondacks. And we canoe and hike in all of our gear and food and tents. And we take our 30 to 35 incoming freshmen, most of whom who have never spent a night in a tent. And we sleep by a mountain lake for 6 days. And we get to know each other. We climb the two highest peaks in New York State, Mount Marcy and Algonquin. And it's really a remarkable opportunity for the new cohort to form as a cohort, and for us to orient them to what life in the Honors College is like. When I first came to Templeton, I interviewed a bunch of alumni because I just wanted to know the feel and history of the place. And over again, these alumni said, oh yeah, one of the most important things we did was go on this camping trip, which at the time I thought was weird because I was like, this is the first thing you did, and it was kind of the fun thing, and because I hadn't been on it yet. But then, first time I went on it and I saw what happened and how deeply formative it is, I realized, oh, that's why this is so significant. Because in part, these students from all over the country come together and they live on this mountain lake, for a week, finding firewood, eating together, and don't have a whole lot else to do at times but play cards, tell stories, hike, get each other up and down these mountains, and enjoy one another's company in a kind of leisurely place. So that then when they start classes that following Monday, they already have history with each other. They have relationships. They have stories together. Yeah. And that's remarkable. The other thing we do when we're up there, we do some orientation stuff. So one of the things I do, they will all begin a course with me called The Good Life. And we always start with Homer's Odyssey. So we all take the Odyssey up to the mountain lake with us. And you'll remember the first 4 books of the Odyssey are often called the Telemachy. They are about Telemachus, who is 18 years old, trying to find his way in an adult world, trying to figure out who he is in relation to his parents and on his own, and he needs mentors and guides. It's the exact situation my students are in. Yeah. And so they all have their books spread out in a circle in this meadow, in this grove of trees. I have upperclassmen come as sponsors to help us out, and we do Odyssey 1 and Odyssey 2 as a reader's theater around them as they sit there and kind of take it all in. And then we begin to have our conversations about what it means to grow up, just like Telemachus, and just in their kind of moment that they're in. So it's a wonderful time. My colleague Fred Putnam goes with us, and we teach kids, how to chop firewood and how to build a fire and how to, keep your food away from bears and whatever kind of thing. So it's a marvelous moment in the life of our college every year.
That's wonderful. Real school A. It sounds.
It is. Yes. It really is. And there's no cell phone reception. We don't let them take phones anyway. But even if they did, there's nothing to do on their phones. Yeah. And so they have to figure out what to do. And so it's a lot of canoeing and swimming and card playing and fire tending and those kind of things. So.
Well, that's great. And I've heard, from you recently, as we've overlapped once or twice, as you say, we're only about an hour and a half apart and go to some of the same conferences. But I've heard some stories I'd love to get again, or I think you might even have some fresh ones of travels lately with some of your children. What are some of the high points of?
Yeah, I love to travel, and I grew up in a family. My dad had led a musical group. He was a music professor, and they would go on tour every summer. This group, and so growing up, I'd spend 6-8 weeks on the road, crisscrossing the country. And it's just deep in my family's blood to travel. Mm-hmm. And for me, as a classical educator and a historical theologian, I just love walking the places where the people I studied walked, so it's remarkable, when you walk through Athens or you walk through Delphi or you walk through wherever, you realize Florence, this is where the people lived and walked that I studied. So I kind of have wanted to visit all the major cities of the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And so last summer, I, with my daughter, initially went to Morocco and spent several days in Fez, an important medieval city, but then went back with her later in the summer to Carthage in Tunisia. And you just think of all that happened in Carthage. I mean, Hannibal was there, the conflicts between Rome and Carthage and Athens, the fact that that's where really Augustine spent his childhood. So to go to the baths of Antoninus, where Augustine was living his rather wayward life for a time, to go to the spot where he and Monica departed, to go to where the Council of the Council of Carthage, the Church Council of Carthage happened, just to walk in those kind of places, to go to Bursa Hill, where Dido watched supposedly Aeneas sail away, and to stand there and see what Dido saw as it's also happened to be the place where King Louis died, St. Louis, on a crusade. So just to walk through those streets and to feel the air, to see the sights, I mean, it just makes all of those stories live in my imagination. So that was pretty remarkable. We had a wonderful kind of 8 days in Tunisia last summer, going down from Tunis and Carthage in the north, and eventually spent a couple nights in the Sahara Desert, out in the sands, looking up at more stars than I have ever seen in my life. And I grew up in the Ozarks of southern Missouri, where we can still see a few stars, not like you can in the Sahara Desert. Yeah. And we just saw, we visited Roman ruins and spent a night in a cave and just explored this really wonderful country that, we went to a second century Roman stone fort out in the desert, because the desert doesn't really care about your roads and forts, and it's going to go where it will. So now it's just completely abandoned. And we took 4-wheelers out there to get to it. And most of these places, I will say, everywhere we went in Carthage, like to go to the spot where Felicity, and I'm just blanking on her name. Oh my goodness, the martyr. Perpetua and Felicity. Oh my goodness. Yeah, where Perpetua and Felicity were martyred, we were the only people there. Wow. And to go to where the Council of Carthage was and be the only people there. I went to the baths of Antoninus, and there was me and one other person there. Went to churches, and just nobody else was there. So to have those kinds of moments, and you feel like the people who lived in these places are your host. Yeah. So when I went to Carthage, I felt like I'm kind of being hosted by Augustine, in a way, hosted by Hannibal and hosted by Monica, because in my imagination, that's kind of where they live. Mm-hmm. So this summer, I was back in Oxford where I did my doctorate, and I was presenting a paper in my field of Christian ethics. And I had some extra days, and I was asking myself, okay, where do I want to go? I've been most places I've wanted to in England. Yeah. And so I jumped a cheap flight to the remote Greek island of Kefalonia and took a ferry across to Ithaca. Yeah. Of course, Odysseus's famous home island. And I teach the Odyssey and have taught the Odyssey for 20 years. Wow. And so I had 4 days by myself hiking, camping and kayaking around Ithaca. And in the poem at one point in time, he complains about it being in this kind of rocky crag in the middle of nowhere. And you're like, okay, it's in the middle of nowhere, but it's stunningly beautiful. And so, again, I was the only person at every place I went, and there were no other tourists there. And a lot of the sites are just, you can access them, but there's no guards, there's no entry fee. Wow. So they're Iron Age forts, 3,000-year-old Iron Age forts. You can get up on. Wow. One day I spent walking from Polis Bay. I could talk about Ithaca for a long time. Polis Bay, which is where the city was closest to what we think is Odysseus's palace. Mm-hmm. And I spent probably 4 hours hiking over this ridge to see what it was like to walk from Polis Bay, where the city was, to Odysseus's palace, where the people came after they heard their sons, who were the suitors who were being slaughtered, just to see what that was like. Wow. Walk back. I got lost lots of times because over this hillside, this massive hillside, there was kind of a trail, but it was crisscrossed by about 1,000 goat trails. And you didn't always know which was which. And so full of brambles. Wow. But it was also the bay where archaeologists in 1930s found 12 iron tripods, which Homer describes being given to Odysseus, that he put in a cave when he washed up on shore. And the supposition is it's very likely that Homer went to Ithaca, knew that those were there, and gave his poem a little street cred by including them in his poem. So then spent a day out kayaking on the wine dark sea, because I said, I got to get out on the sea and get into the water and experience what that was like. Wow. It was just remarkable, wonderful little museum close by. And this is one of these great experiences. Everywhere I've gone in the world, whether it's Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, Europe, Africa, whatever, if you talk to people and you're friendly and you're open, you're going to find people that want to tell you about their place. I had so many encounters like that in Tunisia and Morocco. But here on Ithaca, went to this little kind of postage stamp museum on a back street. I wasn't sure it was in the right place. The sign was laying on the ground, right? And I go in, and apparently it's a museum that one of the 1930s archaeologists founded. Wow. But it's one big room, and they have stuff there that the British Museum would kill to have but it's there. Wow. I'm the only person in there, and they have the iron tripods, parts of them are there, as well as a little fragment that was put in the cave that was a prayer to Odysseus. Wow. So the island has always been associated with Odysseus. Yeah. But then the woman running it, as I walked in, she kind of took my name down or whatever. But then I asked her a question. Mm-hmm. And, I know a little bit about the Odyssey and Ithaca. And so she was like, oh, this guy's interested. 90 minutes later, she finished regaling me stories. And she grew up on the island at the foot of the hill where Odysseus' palace was. Wow. So all of the archaeologists that have come through over the last 2 or 3 decades, she knows. So she told me just all of the story of Ithaca and the archaeological digs. And then it was like, oh, if you're going to go swimming, you got to go to this beach, not that beach, and go get food there and not there. So anyway, I had a marvelous 4 days hiking and kayaking around Ithaca.
Well, that's beautiful. And the North Africa trip, at least, there's an intentional kind of parent-child part of your own children's formation. How regularly do you get to work that in? And what are some of your hopes with that?
Yeah, we lived in the UK for 5 years with my kids, and while there, we were able to crisscross all over England, just visiting. My kids kind of got to the point where they're like, okay, another castle and cathedral, Dad. I think we've seen this one. But they've been to Tintagel, where King Arthur was born. They've been to Caerphilly Castle in southern Wales, part of the Ring of Iron, to suppress the Welsh. They've been there a dozen times. They've been to Tintern Abbey. They know it like that. I mean, they know that super well, as London and Scotland and Canterbury. We were one time in Canterbury for the feast of St. Thomas, when we were in the cathedral, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, led the commemorative service, and murder in the cathedral was reenacted, and we went down into the crypt.
Wow.
We've been to Greece. We've been to Sicily. We went to Syracuse, another great ancient city, obviously called Magna Graecia, bound up in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, major battle there. To walk them to Olympia, where the Olympics were held, to walk them through Delphi, to walk them through Athens, to go to Knossos, to go to Mycenae with them, to go to Corinth with them. I mean, I'm trying to give my kids a sense of the largeness of the world, but also the depth and history of the world. And so to take my daughter, Ilya, who's now 20 and a member of the Honors College, we went to Morocco together and went to Tunisia together. She was doing a gap year back in Oxford, internship at our church there. I want to spark their imaginations. I want to form their affections for this kind of thing. And as any of us know, you can tell a kid, you could tell a kid a book is great to read, or you can read it to them and enact it out. I mean, this is, Kenneth Branagh, great Shakespearean actor, hated Shakespeare through high school because he'd only read it. First time he saw it and had that kind of poetic knowledge and experience of, he fell in love. And so it's the same kind of thing with travel, trying to give my own children form their own affections for these kind of places and these kind of stories and these kind of people. Because, I think world's a wonderful place, and I want these places and these people to live in their imaginations, as well as I want them to encounter, other cultures and other ways of doing things and other food and stuff like that. And so, so when we get the chance, we've done this kind of thing with our kids, and certainly when we lived in Oxford, it was a 6-hour trip from Oxford to Paris, so you take them to France and different places around France. And we did a wonderful World War I and World War II kind of tour through Normandy and areas like that. And I think it especially now that we've come back to the States, where, it's a little boring to live sometimes because everyone speaks English in an American accent. They realize what they've been given versus some of their friends. Anyway, so not everybody's had those kind of opportunities that we have, but I always encourage people to do, find ways to give your children or your students poetic knowledge of these kind of places. When I was at Cair Paravel Latin School teaching, Cair Paravel from its first days, in the 80s, has always taken a week every spring to take its students from grade 5 to 12 on trips around the country. So I used to lead a student trip to New York, and students would go to DC, and they'd go to a dude ranch in Colorado, and they'd go to California, and they'd go to Texas. And then with my Latin teacher, started leading trips to Europe for the same thing, for the same reason, to high school students. We had Greece and Italy and Central Europe, just trying to expand the imaginations of our children and our students. So,
thank you. The one of the labors I know you've been involved with heavily the last couple of years with the renewal, kind of more broadly, even than your work specifically here at Eastern University, is the journal Principia. What are some highlights from that story? Who have you worked with? What are some of the things you're most excited about as you get a peer-reviewed journal off the ground?
This is really exciting. It's been a joint labor of love for a lot of us, especially Rob Jackson from the Great Hearts Institute and Matthew Post, who was at University of Dallas and now University of Tulsa. What I realized when I came back to the States from Oxford and was getting involved in the classical education world again, realized there are a lot of us who, some with advanced degrees, some not, who present at conferences and are doing a lot of good, I think, intellectual work on the tradition related to its, its history, its theory, its pedagogy. But there was no place for us to publish our work because you couldn't publish it in a standard classics journal, which is really about kind of, literature and language of Greece and Rome. and you couldn't publish it in a standard kind of education journal, most of them, because
Yeah.
most of them are oriented kind of progressive education or simply pedagogical techniques. So I kind of had this realization that classical education was its own subgenre or subfield in the academic world, and that to provide a platform for people like me to publish things and other people, and to encourage graduate students to do research in the classical tradition, we needed a venue.
Yeah.
And that meant a peer-reviewed academic journal. And so I talked about this with David Diener as well from Hillsdale. He and I were in Africa together 4 years ago, and we were talking about some of the work he was involved in. I said, man, we got to have a peer-reviewed academic journal as well to give, I think, some academic credibility to what we're doing. I mean, the peer review process is serious, and the authors who have published with us know that it's a serious process, because these people will submit an article and it'll go through a lot of rounds before it comes out in the journal. And so we had serious conversations. I actually remember a Zoom conversation with Rob and Matt when I was at the CAP studios doing something, and we had Rob and Matt and I met kind of every other week for a while, several months, to really get it going. And then COVID hit, kind of slowed things down, but then built this really wonderful editorial team of other people like us, Julia Hayduck and Phil Donnelly from Baylor, David Diener from Hillsdale, as I mentioned, Angel Adams-Parham, who's now at UVA, Rob Jackson, me, Matt, and then we put together an advisory team of people like Eric Ashley Hairston from Wake Forest, folks from Princeton, folks from Baylor, folks from Andrews Werneman, a lot of people who have been involved in classical education, Hamza Yusuf from Zaytuna College, and people who would generally lend their name in support of this project. And so it's a lot of work. I'm general editor, and we probably would have more issues if I had more time to kind of pump out more issues. But my editorial assistant, Nathan Antiel, who also works at CAP and who came through our Masters of Classical Education here in Templeton, he's just been invaluable as well. And so I think our first two issues, we just brought out the second issue within the last month. I think they're good pieces of work. Yeah. And I'm grateful to Baylor University for hosting our website, for the Philosophy Documentation Center for publishing it. I mean, it's a free open access online journal. We are also printing copies of it to distribute at conferences and to select schools that ask for them. And so I think it's been one other piece that the movement, if you will, has needed to help it mature. Yeah. When I came back from Oxford, I thought, we need grad programs to train some of our teachers. And now, we have our grad program here at Templeton. UD has its great program. Gordon has its program for leaders in the classical school world. I also thought we needed a journal. Now we've got a peer-reviewed academic journal started. And I think, we're moving more of these pieces in place. We've got the CLTs, a great standardized test, more of these pieces in place to just really entrench classical education in such a way that, as I tell Chris Parent all the time, we can stop calling it a movement. It's just classical education. It's a thing. It's a thing that's here, and it's a thing that's going to stay. So let's just stop calling it a movement, and just say it is classical education.
Right. Something that's been around, well over 2,000 years. You'd think it didn't have to, be graced with movement or renewal or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. We're just the latest moment in a 2,500-year-old history here, and it's gone through. It's waxed and waned, obviously, but it is what it is, and we're just doing our thing in the moment. So,
well, we're winding down on time, but I did want to see if we could fit in one more question. The Women in the Tradition course, which is our reason for working together today, and some other great conversations and materials, books in the most recent iteration. I'm avoiding renewal or movement. The ongoing work of classical education.
There you go. Thank you.
There's a lot of conversation recently about the nature of the canon, and I wonder if you have any just kind of you wrote about it in the in a journal piece, so obviously you could go on some length, but just
But
briefly,
don't. I hear you saying that's a kind way to say, but don't. That's nice of you,
yeah,
Jesse.
what are some high points, and as you kind of follow this conversation, key points that you want to drive home?
Sure. And I'll just say that along with my interest in starting a grad program and feeling the need for a peer-reviewed journal, when I came back from the UK, I also thought we need to give serious thought to our inclusion of women in our curricula from the tradition, and at least African American voices from the tradition. And so those have been two concerns of mine for the last really 6-7 years, and I've been grateful to have worked with folks like Anika Prather and Angel Adams-Parham. We led during COVID for the SCL conference a race channel on some of these kinds of things, and been trying to introduce into my talks and writings African American classicists from the tradition and women from the tradition that are largely just unknown. And so in a way, it's a bit of recovery or repair work to say, these authors, they're there. They had an influence. They were deeply immersed in the tradition, and we ought to know about them for multiple reasons. Not just because these are questions our contemporary moment is asking, right, but that's no small thing. I mean, to say, those are good questions, and maybe we need to do a little bit more work there, but we have responses. We have a way to answer that. This isn't a tradition of just, if you will, dead white European male. Right. There's been really good work, obviously, and Cap, published Anika and Angel's book on this, and a lot of work done there. And we hosted Angel along with Ashley Hairston, whose wonderful book, The Ebony Column, was published several years ago, and Cornell West. We had them on campus for a session on classical education of the Black intellectual tradition, trying to do the same kind of thing now with women in the liberal arts tradition. I teach, as part of our MAT program, a course called The History and Philosophy of Ancient and Medieval Education. And a part of that month-long online course is a week on women in the tradition. And it's really been remarkable to me and really satisfying the last several times I've taught it to, almost to a person in the class, my students like Jolie Hodge at Cap, who's really kind of the impetus behind the Classical U course. She said, why have we never heard of these people? Why did I not know about them? Why have I not read them? Why did I think that no women were educated at all until the 19th or 18th century? But to find, it's kind of work of discovery. And it's a little bit like, I have this talk and article on history of grades and grading, just to say, let's do a little bit of this kind of historical work and find out what's actually there. And so when you start digging in and you find somebody like Christine de Pizan, you're like, how is she? And I'll say, I was in a room of academics trying to think of authors, I won't say for what, but authors that we might introduce to students. And I mentioned Christine de Pizan, and out of a room of probably 40 academics involved in our classical education, only one other person who happened to be a Harvard historian had heard of her, and she's amazing. And Duoda and, more contemporary authors, like Dorothy Sayers or Flannery O'Connor or, Anna G. Cooper. So anyway, it's a work to say to, classical education, listen, these women are there. They were educated, they received the tradition, they passed it on. We can learn from them because, Christine has this great line where she sounds sometimes like a first wave feminist, the 20th century, but she's speaking as a Christian deeply immersed in the classical tradition. And she looks at some of the books from the tradition and she just says, if women had written these, they wouldn't have been written like this. They wouldn't portray men and women and love and society in this kind of way. And, besides all of her work on politics and culture, there's just fascinating stuff. So I think it's important for us, just for the sake of truth, to know that they're there. And for the sake of our contemporary students, both men and women, for our boys to see, oh no, there are deeply educated, influential women from the tradition we got to know about, and models for our women. And I think that we ought to be reading these women. I think their portraits ought to be up in our schools. And I think they just ought to be regular conversation partners. And, on the canon question, Some of these women, it is very clear, like Christine de Pizan, their books were suppressed and not disseminated because they were women, or for her, several of them were published, but not in her name. Presumably because she was a woman. So you might say, well, they haven't been part of the canon historically because maybe they didn't have the influence, other than, like Sappho, obviously, didn't have the influence of some of their male counterparts. To which I say, yeah, but the canon has always been porous. Nobody read Dante before Dante wrote. Nobody read Shakespeare before Shakespeare wrote. Nobody read, Epic of Gilgamesh until the 19th century because we didn't know it existed. But as soon as we discovered these things, we put them into the canon and put them in dialogue with everybody else. So there's no reason that now we can't take these women and reintroduce them to our curricula and put them in dialogue in the canon for future generations. Because the canon, the canon is just like what we read and what we see in dialogue with each other. And so this is what happens in a tradition, and I won't wax too eloquent here, Jesse, but indulge me. Every generation receives a certain set of texts and questions from the generation before it.
Yeah.
And that current generation, like ours, has to decide, okay, which of those do we keep? Which of those are relevant to us? But maybe there were things 2 generations ago that the just previous generation didn't pass on, but we recognize that we need now.
Yeah.
And I would say that's kind of where we're at with some of these authors and some of these, in this case, some of these women. We need to hear their voices. And it would be right to do so, and then to pass on to the next generation a curricula of books and authors where it was just normative that you read Duoda about moral formation of children, and normative and just normal that you read Christine de Pizan in dialogue with Boccaccio and Dante and Augustine and Plato, and normal that you read, Flannery O'Connor or Anna Julia Cooper. So the next generation, they don't have to do that recovery work. They don't have to do that repair work. And so I think it's kind of a vocation perhaps laid on some of us in this moment to do some of that work for the sake of our current schools, but then for the sake of successive generations that come after us. And that's what it means to be part of a tradition, and certainly the classical tradition.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Brian. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks, man. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to the Classical U podcast. Please do check out our website, classicalu.com, and our teacher magazine, Altum. We hope you've enjoyed these conversations with presenters and live learning event hosts with Classical U.